Welcome to Dark Broadcast. Stay quiet and stay aware.
The Passenger. Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Arthur Page. I am an archaeologist and I made a terrible mistake. I'm not saying this for fame or scientific recognition. I'm saying it because this might be my last will and testament, and because I need someone to know. Someone who might encounter the same thing needs to understand what they're dealing with. This is not a survival guide. It's a warning. It all started in Rome. Not the Rome full of tourists and lovebirds tossing coins into the Trevi fountain. My Rome lies deep underground, in the stone guts of history, where it smells of dust, time, and something else for which I have no name. I specialize in the late Roman Empire, specifically its periods of decline, when the old gods were dying and new, strange cults were pushing through the cracks of civilization like mold. My old friend Luca, an Italian archaeologist, called me. His voice on the phone was tight with excitement. "Arthur, you won't believe it. We found a new level, in San Callisto, not the tourist part, deeper. No one has been down there for perhaps 1,500 years. San Callisto is one of the oldest and most extensive catacombs. I've been there dozens of times, but a new level, those are words that make any archaeologist drool. It's like finding a secret room in your own house that you never knew existed." 2 days later, I was on site. Workers had cleared a narrow passage, hidden behind a collapse in one of the most abandoned galleries. The opening was black as a maw, and from it wafted air that was cold and dead, devoid of the smell of life. We descended, me, Luca, and 2 of his assistants. It was unlike other catacombs. The walls here weren't lined with burial niches or frescoes of biblical scenes. They were bare, roughly hewn, and they descended at a steep angle, forming a long, narrowing tunnel. Our flashlights snatched only a few meters of the path ahead from the darkness. The air was thick and heavy, pressing on our eardrums. We walked in silence, our footsteps swallowed by the inexplicable acoustics of the place. The sound didn't echo, but seemed absorbed by the stone. We walked for almost an hour before the tunnel opened into a circular chamber. It wasn't a room, it was something else. A vaulted ceiling, but the walls were covered in carvings, not Latin script or images of lambs. These were twisting, nonsensical patterns that hurt the eyes. They didn't form familiar shapes, but if you stared long enough, they began to writhe at the edge of your vision. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, lay a single object. The artifact. It was made of a material like obsidian, but deeper black, blacker than the surrounding darkness itself. It was the size of a human heart and had an irregular, almost organic shape. But the most terrifying thing wasn't that. It emitted a pulsation, not a sound or a light. It was a pulsation in reality itself. I felt it with my skin, my bones. A quiet, vile rhythm that countered the beat of my own heart. Luca cautiously approached. "What the hell is it?" he whispered. I didn't know, but the thrill of the researcher ignited in me. This was a find that could rewrite textbooks. Something that fit into no known cultural context. "Don't touch it, Arthur," Luca said, but his warning sounded far away. I put on gloves. My hand reached for the artifact on its own, as if moved by another's will. The air thickened to the consistency of jelly. When my fingers closed around the cold, almost living surface of the stone, the world exploded. The silence was torn by a deafening, soundless shriek born not in the ears but directly in the brain. The flashlights died, plunging us into absolute impenetrable darkness. The stone floor trembled underfoot. Dust and small stones rained from the ceiling. And in that darkness I felt a release. Something immense, ancient, and inexpressibly malevolent that had been locked here was set free, and I had done it. One of the assistants screamed. There was the sound of running. Luca grabbed my arm and dragged me back into the tunnel. As if in a dream, I convulsively clenched the artifact in my hand and ran after him, blinded by panic and darkness. We scrambled back up, gasping, covered in dust and fear. I lied to Luca, said I'd dropped the artifact in the dark. He looked at me suspiciously but nodded. We sealed the passage with concrete slabs. That should have been the end of the story, but it was only the beginning. The artifact was with me. I had stolen it. A stupidity bordering on madness, but I couldn't leave it there. It called to me. I could feel its cold even through the layers of padding in my backpack. Back in my small rented apartment on the outskirts of Rome, I finally dared to examine it. I placed it on the kitchen table. It lay there like a piece of night, absorbing the light from the lamp. The pulsation continued. Now it was stronger, a quiet, insistent thud in the silence of my apartment. The first night I had a dream, or rather a nightmare. I stood in that very circular chamber, but the walls were not of stone, but of flesh, and they were breathing. The carved patterns writhed like worms, and before me stood a shadow. Not a figure, not a silhouette, but an embodied absence of light. It had no face, only two coal black spots that were eyes, full of cold, stellar hunger. It did not speak, but I heard its voice directly in my mind. Ancient as the void itself, the grinding of thousands of voices. You keybearer, the gate is unlocked, I will come. I woke up in a cold sweat, a scream stuck in my throat. The apartment was cold, though the heating was on. I went into the living room. The artifact lay on the table. I thought it pulsed slightly faster. The next few days were waking hell. I began to notice the shadow in my peripheral vision. Over there in the hallway, out of the corner of my eye. Outside the window at dusk, a dark silhouette would appear for a moment. When I read, I felt as if someone stood behind me, breathing icy breath on my neck. I'd turn around, no one. Smells appeared. Sudden, sharp smells of sulfur and rot that would wash over me for a few seconds and vanish just as quickly. At night, I heard footsteps in the empty apartment. Slow, heavy, as if something enormous and clumsy was wandering through the rooms. I tried to get rid of the artifact. Once I took it to the Tiber to throw it into the water, but when I reached the bridge, I found my legs refusing to obey. Panic gripped my throat and the voice in my head whispered, "Mine." I returned home, trembling, with the cursed thing in my pocket. It had become an anchor, tying the ship of my soul to whatever lurked in the dark. I realized the demon, for it could only be one, wasn't just haunting me. It was feeding on me, on my fear, on my loneliness. Each flash of terror made it stronger and its manifestations more real. One night I woke from the feeling that I was not alone in the room. I lay on my back and couldn't move, sleep paralysis, but this was something more. The shadow stood at the foot of my bed. It was denser, more real than ever. Its coal eyes burned with a cold fire. It slowly leaned toward me. I felt a freezing cold emanating from it. Its faceless head was inches from my face. Flesh is weak, but spirit stubborn, it grated in my head. Soon we will become one keybearer. It touched my forehead. The touch was like an electric shock, burning cold. I felt something alien, dark, and viscous seeping into my mind. Memories, not my own, surfaced before my eyes. Ancient cities in flames, sacrifices under black stars, wars waged before mankind existed. I screamed, but no sound came out. In the morning, a scar remained on my forehead, small, like a burn in the shape of a strange, twisted symbol. From that moment, everything changed. The shadow was with me always now. It didn't just appear in my peripheral vision, it was in it. I saw the world as if through a light, dark haze. Its presence became the background noise of my existence, a weight on my shoulders. I stopped going out, canceled all contracts, stopped answering calls from Luca and family back in the States. I sat in my apartment with the curtains drawn, listening to its footsteps, its breathing, how it whispered stories of the end of all things into my ear. I tried to research, to seek information, but everything I found about demons and exorcism seemed like child's play compared to this ancient, impersonal evil. This was not a demon from grimoires with a name and title. This was chaos. This was a void hungry to be filled with life, and I was its vessel. The decisive night came a week ago. I lay on the floor in the living room, unable to get up. Physically, I had barely eaten for days, but that wasn't the main thing. My will was broken. The shadow stood over me, filling the entire room. It was no longer a shadow. It was real. I felt its weight, its mass. Cold radiated from it in waves. The time has come, Keybearer. You freed me from the stone prison. Now you will give me a haven in the prison of flesh. It leaned down, and this time its form acquired features. Long, bony limbs, an elongated head, and those eyes, they were like two black holes, sucking in light and hope. It pushed its ethereal form into my chest. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't physical pain. It was the sensation of being turned inside out on a psychic level. I felt my consciousness shrink, pushed into a small, dark corner of my own brain. I fought. I screamed. I remembered my parents' faces, sunny days from childhood, my first love, every bright thing I had. But the darkness was older, stronger. It erased those memories, one by one, like a wave erasing drawings in the sand. The process took the whole night. I felt myself fading. And then I woke up. I was in my bed. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. My body obeyed me. There was no panic, no horror. There was only emptiness, a deep, all-consuming calm. I got up and went to the mirror. I looked at my reflection. It was me, Dr. Arthur Page. The same brown eyes, the same wrinkles at the temples, but something was wrong. The gaze was alien, deep and old, too calm. I smiled at my reflection, and the smile was slow, unnatural, devoid of any joy. A smile learned by watching others. I understood I had lost, but I hadn't died. It didn't kill me, it occupied me. I am now just a passenger in my own body, a spectator. I am locked in the farthest room of my mind, and from there I watch as it uses my life. It controls my limbs, my voice, my face. It studies this world through my eyes. It reads my memories like a book and laughs at them. Yesterday, I called Luca. I told him in my own voice that everything was fine, that I'd had a nervous breakdown from overwork, but now I felt wonderful. I even made a joke. That was the most horrible thing. To hear my own lips utter words I hadn't thought and laugh a laugh I didn't feel. This morning, I bought a plane ticket to New York. One thing is to study the world of a lonely American archaeologist in Rome. Another is to plunge into the whirlpool of life in a big city, into millions of people, into a whole continent full of fresh, unprotected energy. It is going home. In my body. And I can do nothing. I tried to resist, tried to make my hand tremble when I signed the passport. Nothing. The control is absolute. I can only think, feel, and watch. That is why I am telling this. While I, or rather it, packs the suitcases, I, the real me, am using the last crumbs of my will to issue this warning. Perhaps it's pointless. Perhaps no one will believe it. But if you are reading this, be careful. If you meet a man named Arthur Page on the street with cold eyes and a strange, practiced smile, run. It is ancient, it is hungry, and now it has a face. My face.
Do you think fear or curiosity mattered more here? People often see it differently.
Noise on the 80th floor. Sometimes, when I stared at the monitor for too long, I caught myself hatting that window. The view from the 80th floor was stunning. The city lay below like a glowing electrical diagram. But the window itself was a huge, black, cold spot in my peripheral vision. The sun never shone directly into it, only the reflected, sanitized light from other glass giants. My cubicle was one of those considered a perk, by the wall, with a partial divider and this black mirror onto the world. In the silence of late evening, when only the cleaners and I remained somewhere in the distance, the reflection in the glass showed not me, but some empty, frozen version of the space. Like a refrigerator, unplugged but still holding the cold. It started with a draft, a faint but constant movement of air at the back of my neck, as if someone was breathing quietly, steadily onto my skin. The AC, I checked. The ventilation grates were far away. The temperature sensors read normal. I chalked it up to fatigue. The Argo project hung over our team like a thundercloud, and I was sleeping 4 hours a night. Coffee stopped helping, but then the noise started. Barely perceptible, high frequency, almost at the edge of hearing, like an old electronic device humming from strain. I asked my colleagues. Sarah from the next cubicle just shrugged in confusion. Maybe get your hearing checked, Chris, or take a vacation. You look like you've seen a ghost. Then came the tech. The printer in the common hallway started spitting out blank sheets in the middle of the night when I was alone. The first time, I found a stack of white paper in the morning and thought someone had forgotten to remove a job from the queue. The second time, I heard it myself. That nasty crackling and buzzing at 3 a.m. The printouts had no text, not even toner smudges. Just barely noticeable dents in the paper, as if the printhead was hammering the blank sheet with furious force. I called the IT guy. He tapped his temple, checked the logs. Empty commands, Chris. The system's clean. Maybe you hit something yourself while dozing off at the keyboard. The keyboard, that got personal. My laptop started acting like it had a second user. The cursor trembled when my hands were in my lap. In complex spreadsheets I'd worked on for hours, numbers changed before my eyes, not formula errors, but actual changes. A 1 turned into a 7, a 0 into an 8. I checked the version history, it wasn't there. I copied files to a flash drive. The corrupted versions were already on it. And one morning, I found an open notepad on my desk with letters typed hundreds of times, until the page turned into a black rectangle of text. I didn't believe in ghosts. I believed in glitches, hacker attacks, my own exhausted psyche. But then objects started moving. The coffee cup I definitely placed on the left edge of the desk was on the right when I turned back to the monitor. Pens vanished from the holder and turned up in the paper tray. Document folders got rearranged. I installed a motion detection app on my phone. One night, after spending 5 minutes in the bathroom to calm my shaking hands, I watched the recording. It showed my favorite company logo mug slowly, inch by inch, sliding across the desk to the very edge, pausing for a second and falling, shattering to pieces. I hadn't heard it fall. When I returned, the shards were already on the floor. That was impossible. Impossible. Paranoia became my second skin. I started staying at the office even later, not to work, but to observe. I set tape traps on cabinet doors, dusted a thin layer of powder borrowed from Sarah on the desk, set up a webcam. There were results. The tape snapped. Weird, shapeless prints appeared in the powder, nothing like fingerprints. One night, the camera captured all the sticky notes on my board detaching at once and fanning out onto the floor. But it wasn't enough. Too little for anyone but me to believe. It, however, seemed to understand and changed tactics. It stopped being a quiet saboteur. It started working against me during business hours. During a crucial video call with a client in Tokyo, my microphone suddenly began transmitting not my voice, but that same high-frequency whine mixed with the whisper I heard at night. I frantically jabbed the mute button, but nothing helped until I yanked the cable from my laptop in panic. The client was furious. My manager, Martha, called me on the carpet. I tried to explain, stammering about a technical glitch interference. She looked at me with cold detachment. "Chris, your work lately has been subpar. You're jumpy, you're making errors in the data, and now this. You need a break, seriously." But there was no break. Only the office turning into my prison, smells, a sudden sharp scent of ozone and old paper that no one but me noticed. Temperature. My cubicle was always a few degrees colder, something even colleagues coming to test my theory confirmed. They joked, knocked on the walls, said, "Come out, ghost." But in their eyes I saw not humor but wariness. They began to avoid me. The climax was the presentation for the board of directors. A month of work. All the data checked dozens of times, saved in 5 different places. I stood before the screen, started speaking, and on the very first slide the numbers crawled. Percentages shifted, graphs distorted into absurd peaks, and at the bottom in small font a line appeared. "He is here, he is here, he is here," I shouted. Not from fear, but from powerless rage. I threw my laser pointer at the screen. Dead silence hung in the room. They looked at me not as a victim, but as a lunatic, a dangerous glitch in the corporate system. I was suspended, sent on administrative leave. The last evening before this sentence took effect, I spent in my cubicle packing my things into a cardboard box. The city below shone, indifferent and beautiful. Here in this glass box, a cold, malevolent silence reigned. I sat and looked at my reflection in the black window, and it looked back at me, but something was off. In the reflection, I was sitting differently. My head was tilted at another angle, and the lips in the reflection slowly stretched into a smile that wasn't on my real face. This wasn't a ghost, not a spirit. It was something else. An impersonal, intelligent cruelty born perhaps from the place itself, from the stress, the burnout, the fear, from millions of hours of meaningless work soaked into the carpet and drywall. A poltergeist feeding on paranoia. And it chose me, not to kill, but to take me apart, to show everyone that inside Chris Hayes was nothing but fear and impending failure. I powered on my laptop one last time. It hummed. On the clean, new desktop, a single window opened, a text editor. Line by line, with inhuman speed, words scrolled. It was my internal monologue, my most shameful work fears, my secret contemptuous thoughts about colleagues, my terror of the future, everything I'd never told anyone, everything I was afraid to admit even to myself. It knew. It pulled it all out and displayed it on the screen, glaring and obscene. And then the sending process began. Addresses appeared by themselves in the recipient field. Sarah, Martha, head of HR, the entire board. I scrambled to pull the cord to smash the keyboard, but the laptop was on battery. I slammed the lid shut. It popped right back open. The screen blinked. Sent. I don't remember riding the elevator down or walking out. I stood at the foot of the glass giant and looked up at my 80th floor. There in my former cubicle, the light was still on, and for a moment I thought I saw a dark, indistinct silhouette in that black window, my window. It was looking down at me and waving goodbye. I was fired, of course, for conduct compromising the company's reputation. The email, full of madness and hate, though I didn't write it, was the final nail. I didn't try to justify myself What could I say? That an office poltergeist ruined my life. I don't get called for interviews anymore. Guess the industry has its ways of sharing gossip. I sit at home in the silence of my apartment and listen to the drafts, to the hum of the fridge, to the ticking clock. I'm waiting for the noise, that same high frequency, barely there noise, to manifest here. Because I brought it with me. Not in my things. It's in me. It's my personal poltergeist now. And its only purpose is to remind me that up there on the 80th floor, in the cold silence behind the black glass, someone or something has taken my place. And is smiling.
Was there a moment that felt strangely familiar to you? It happens more often than you'd think.
The shadows we carry. Calling it a fresh start would have been too generous. It was more of an escape. We were running from our old life, from the creaky floorboards in my parents' house, from the sideways glances of her friends, from everything that reminded us of that night. The new apartment in an old but solid brick building on the outskirts of Boston was supposed to be our cocoon, a place where we could lick our wounds and stitch back together the torn fabric of our marriage. Sarah looked at the high ceilings and the fireplace with hope, while I saw only another cage, albeit a more spacious one. The first days were quiet like a prayer. We tiptoed around each other like sappers in a minefield. Pass the salt, please. Do you mind if I turn on the TV? Every phrase was carefully measured, devoid of emotion. We were afraid that one wrong word, one sharp tone, and the fragile ice would crack again. The first manifestation was so insignificant that I chalked it up to fatigue. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the curtain by the window flutter, even though the window was closed. I stayed silent. Why scare Sarah? Why give us a new reason for worry? But the silence couldn't last forever. The first real fight happened over a trifle, an unwashed cup in the sink. It wasn't the object of the dispute itself, but everything behind it. My restlessness, her perpetual dissatisfaction, the bitterness we swallowed but never digested. We shouted at each other in the kitchen, and at the most furious moment, when Sarah slammed that ill-fated cup into the sink with all her might, a stack of plates crashed down from the top shelf of the cabinet. Perfectly clean plates that I had arranged myself just an hour earlier. We froze. The crash gave way to a ringing silence. Was that an earthquake? Sarah whispered, her face pale. No, I replied, looking at the shards of porcelain scattered on the floor. It wasn't an earthquake. From that day on, our house became alive, and it hated our discord. Every argument, every suppressed resentment, every icy silence became fuel for it. Doors began to slam shut by themselves, always at moments when one of us tried to walk away from a conversation. I would go to the bedroom, slamming the door, and a second later the living room door, where Sarah remained, would slam shut with the same crash, as if an invisible force echoed our anger. One evening, after an especially heavy silent dinner, we sat in the living room. Sarah was knitting, I pretended to read. Tension hung in the air thicker than fog, and then I saw it. From her bedroom, the door slightly ajar, a shadow emerged, unclear, blurry, like a spot in my peripheral vision. It was short, childlike. It walked across the hall and dissolved into the kitchen wall. My breath caught. Did you see that? I breathed out. Sarah looked up at me. There was no fear in her eyes, only tired emptiness. What, a draft again? She hadn't seen it, but I had, and I understood that this something knew. It knew our secrets. The manifestations grew more aggressive. At night, crying came from the wall behind our bed. Quiet, wrenching, childlike crying. It woke me while Sarah slept like a log, or pretended to. Once I woke up because someone was breathing directly into my face. There was no one in the room, but on the pillow, a centimeter from my nose, lay an antique doll with a porcelain face. We never bought anything like that. Its glass eyes looked at me with silent reproach. I started digging into the history of the house. An old neighbor, Mr. O'Donnell, who had lived here since the 40s, told me a sad story over a cup of tea. Before us, the McKinnon family lived here. Their youngest daughter, Emily, 7 years old, was seriously ill. The parents, devastated by grief and medical bills, argued constantly. They shouted so loudly it could be heard through the wall. They blamed each other, said terrible things in their anger. One night, after a particularly heated row, the girl took a turn for the worse. She died before the ambulance arrived. They said her last words were, "Daddy, Mommy, please stop." I returned home with this knowledge. It weighed on me heavier than any burden. I told Sarah everything. She listened without interrupting, then turned to the window. "She hears us," Sarah said quietly. "She hears us becoming just like them." We tried to be quieter. We pretended everything was fine. We smiled at breakfast, kissed goodbye at the door, but the pretense was worse than the fights. It was poison slowly eating away at us from the inside, and the house felt it. It sensed the falseness. The walls began to cry, literally. In the corner of the living room, near that same window where it all began, damp spots appeared on the wallpaper, salty to the taste. At night, in the silence, there was the sound of quiet, inconsolable sobbing. The final night came on the anniversary of that very tragedy that happened to us before the move. Sarah and I had lost a child, early term. We hadn't told anyone. We locked that grief inside like an unspoken secret and tried to move on, pretending the wound had healed. But it hadn't. It festered. That night we didn't fight. We just lay in bed back to back, and grief hung between us like a dense, invisible wall. I thought about our unborn son, what he might have been like. How Sarah and I, consumed by our own pain, hadn't even mourned him together. And then the house exploded. Everything around us came to life. Dishes flew out of the cabinets and smashed against the walls. Paintings fell from their hooks. Furniture creaked and moved by itself. And in the center of this chaos, in the middle of the living room, stood her. The girl, Emily. Not a shadow, not a hint, but a clear, almost tangible image. A dress, a pale face, huge, tear-filled eyes. She looked at us, and in her gaze there was no malice. There was desperation and understanding. She raised her hand and pointed at us. And then her voice, thin as a spider's thread, rustled in the air filled with crashing sounds. "Don't be silent. Please don't be silent like they were. That hurts more." And I understood. This wasn't a poltergeist. This was an echo of someone else's unspoken pain resonating with our own. It fed on our silence, our unprocessed sorrow. It was trying to reach us, to make us talk, cry, scream, do anything but keep that poison inside. I turned to Sarah. She was looking at the ghost, and tears were streaming down her face. Real tears, the first in many months. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, looking not at the girl but at me. "I'm so sorry we never talked about our baby." "Me too," I breathed out, and some enormous crushing block inside me finally shifted. At that same moment, the noise stopped. The girl looked at us for another moment, and something like peace appeared on her face. Then she slowly dissolved into the air like mist. Right now our apartment is quiet, truly quiet. We cried all night, holding hands, talking about our loss, our pain, our fear. We finally spoke our secrets. But the end of this story is sad. Because sometimes, passing by the wall in the living room, I still feel a faint, almost intangible dampness. And at night, in the deepest silence, I think I hear a quiet sigh. A sigh of relief mixed with eternal sadness. We have healed, and she remains, alone, an echo of someone else's pain, doomed to forever seek the silence that it itself disturbs.
Every listener sees these stories differently. I'm curious how you saw this one. We'll meet again when the frequency stabilizes.